Marcel Cerdan stepped into the ring that night without knowing that somewhere in the crowd behind him, Edith Piaf was watching, and that by the end of the evening, so would a great many other people in Paris. The arena was full long before the main fight began, the way it always was on nights like this. Cigarette smoke hung in layers under the lights, thick enough that the ring itself seemed to glow inside a kind of haze. The crowd noise was constant, not the focused roar of a single moment, but the steady churn of thousands of people talking, calling out to friends across rows, settling into seats, waiting. Vendors moved through the aisles. Somewhere near the back, in a row that had not been reserved for anyone in particular, a woman in a plain dark coat sat with her collar raised, a scarf covering most of her hair, watching the ring with an attention that, to anyone glancing at her, would have looked like nothing more than an ordinary fan's interest in an ordinary fight. To understand why Edith Piaf was sitting in that seat, in that coat, on that night, you have to understand what boxing meant in Paris during this period, and what Marcel Cerdan meant to the people who filled arenas like this one. Boxing in post-war Paris was not a niche sport followed by a small devoted audience. It was one of the great public spectacles of the era, an event that drew crowds the size of theater audiences, but with none of a theater's quiet formality. Fight nights were loud, communal, unpredictable. They brought together people from every part of the city in a way few other events did. A champion was not simply an athlete. He was a kind of public property, someone whose career the entire city felt invested in, whose victories were celebrated in cafes the next morning, and whose losses were argued about for days. Marcel Cerdan was, by this point in his career, exactly that kind of figure. He had built his reputation through years of disciplined, relentless work, the kind of fighter other boxers respected before audiences ever learned to love him, and the kind audiences loved once they understood what they were watching. He carried himself in the ring with a calm that some opponents mistook, briefly and at their own cost, for caution. There was nothing showy about the way he fought. He simply continued round after round with a patience that eventually became its own kind of intimidation. For Edith Piaf, the evening carried a weight that had nothing to do with boxing itself and everything to do with what it meant for her to be there at all. By this point in her career, Edith Piaf's life was followed by the public with an intensity that left very little room for privacy. Her performances were reviewed, her tours were tracked, her movements through Paris were noted by people who recognized her on sight, in restaurants, in hotel lobbies, on the street outside theaters. This was simply the condition of her fame, one she had long since learned to live inside, the way a person learns to live inside a small apartment, finding ways to exist comfortably even when there is very little space that belongs only to them. Her relationship with Marcel Cerdan existed, at this stage, in a strange and increasingly fragile category, known in the way that almost everything about famous people eventually became known, to a circle of people close to both of them, but not yet something either of them had to discuss publicly. Not yet a fact that newspapers printed outright. Not yet something strangers felt entitled to ask about. It existed in the particular space reserved for things that are technically secret, but functionally understood. Protected less by genuine concealment than by the unspoken agreement of everyone nearby not to be the one who said it out loud first. This arrangement worked for a while, because both of their public lives were extremely full, and because the spaces where their private life and public life overlapped were relatively easy to control. She did not generally attend his fights. He did not generally attend her performances in any way that drew attention. Whatever existed between them mostly existed in places neither the press nor the public had access to. Hotel corridors, late dinners, the kind of evenings that left no photographs behind. Tonight was different, and Edith Piaf had known it would be different before she ever left for the arena. She had wanted, for reasons she had not fully explained, even to the small number of people who helped arrange the evening, to see this particular fight in person, not from a private box, not with any of the usual arrangements that would have placed her somewhere visible, somewhere expected, somewhere that photographers would have known to look. She wanted to sit in the crowd, the way an ordinary person would sit in the crowd, and watch Marcel Cerdan fight the way thousands of other people in that arena were about to watch him fight. As a spectator, swept up in the noise and the tension of the room, with no one paying any particular attention to her at all. It was, in its way, a small act of theft, taking, for one evening, the kind of ordinary experience that her fame had made permanently unavailable to her. And, for the first hour or so after she took her seat, it worked exactly as she had hoped. The coat did its job. The scarf did its job. The row she had chosen, far enough back to be unremarkable, close enough to see clearly, did its job. She was, for a little while, simply a woman in the crowd. The fight itself unfolded the way fights involving Marcel Cerdan often unfolded. Careful in the early rounds, his opponent testing him, looking for openings that did not appear. The crowd's energy rose and fell with the rhythm of the rounds, surging during exchanges, settling into a low murmur during the breaks, building again as the fight progressed and the outcome began to feel less uncertain. It was sometime around the midpoint of the fight that the moment arrived, not during a dramatic exchange in the ring, but during one of the quieter stretches, when attention in the crowd tends to drift, when people glance away from the ring to talk to the person next to them, to look for a vendor, to simply rest their eyes for a moment on something other than the fighters. Someone, a few rows away, looked at the woman in the dark coat for slightly longer than a glance requires. This was the choice point of the evening, though it was not Edith Piaf's choice to make. It belonged instead to a stranger, someone who had looked, recognized something familiar in a profile half hidden by a scarf, and now had to decide, in the space of a few seconds, what to do with that recognition. Say nothing and let the moment pass, the way most such moments passed in a city full of famous faces glimpsed in unexpected places. Or say something to the person beside them in a voice not quite quiet enough. The second option was the one that happened. It did not happen all at once. Recognition in a crowd of that size rarely does. It moved the way these things move, a whispered word to a neighbor, a head turning, another head turning to see what the first head was looking at, a small ripple of attention spreading outward from a single point, slow enough at first that Edith Piaf herself did not immediately notice it, focused as she was on the ring. By the time she did notice, by the time the shift in the air around her became impossible not to feel, the particular quality of attention that famous people learn to recognize the way other people recognize a change in weather, it was already too late to do anything about it. The ripple had widened. People nearby were no longer watching the fight. They were watching her, with the careful, half-hidden curiosity of people trying not to be obvious about staring and failing. Edith Piaf did not stand up. She did not pull the scarf tighter or turn away. For a moment, she simply sat very still, aware that the choice she had quietly made hours earlier, to come here, to sit in this seat, to be, for one evening, an ordinary person in a crowd, had just been taken out of her hands entirely. And then, in the ring, Marcel Cerdan landed a combination that ended the round early, and the entire arena erupted. The kind of sound that swallows everything else. A wall of noise that for a few seconds made it impossible to think about anything except what had just happened in the ring. In that single moment, the roar of the crowd, the ring lights, Marcel Cerdan stepping back to his corner, something in the arena shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the fight at all. The same wave of attention that had been creeping toward Edith Piaf a moment earlier was, for those few seconds, completely absorbed by something else. The crowd was no longer thinking about the woman in the dark coat. They were thinking about the fight. When the noise settled and people's attention began inevitably to drift back toward her, something had changed. The earlier whispers had already done their work. Enough people now knew, or thought they knew, who was sitting in that row, that the information had passed beyond the point where it could be contained by a scarf or a turned-up collar. But the roar of the crowd a moment earlier had given the moment a strange kind of cover. People who looked toward her now did so more openly, but also more briefly, drawn back again and again to the ring, to Marcel Cerdan, to the fight that was still the actual event of the evening. Edith Piaf understood, sitting there, that something had just happened that could not be undone. Not a scandal, not an announcement, nothing so dramatic as that. Simply this: a few hundred people in that arena now knew something about her that, until that evening, had existed only in the careful, unspoken category of things everyone suspected but no one confirmed. And from a few hundred people in a city the size of Paris, it would not take long to become something closer to common knowledge. Not through any official statement, not through any newspaper headline, but through the much quieter and much faster mechanism of people simply telling each other what they had seen. The fight continued. Marcel Cerdan won, in the way he usually won, not spectacularly, but completely, an opponent who had run out of answers long before the final bell. The crowd's celebration afterward was loud and genuine, filling the arena with the kind of noise that no longer had anything to do with Edith Piaf at all. She left before the arena had fully emptied, the way she had planned to all along, though for entirely different reasons than she had imagined when she planned it. The coat and scarf no longer mattered. By the time she reached the street outside, the small crowd gathered near the exits, people waiting for friends, for cars, for the night to properly end, had already begun to notice her in a way that had nothing tentative about it anymore. What followed in the days afterward was not an announcement, not a statement, not anything that either Edith Piaf or Marcel Cerdan ever directly addressed. What followed was simply a shift in the way people in Paris talked about the two of them, a shift from careful suggestion to something closer to assumption, The kind of change that happens not because anyone confirms anything, but because enough people have now seen something with their own eyes that the old caution no longer makes sense to maintain. For Marcel Cerdan, the fight remained, in the records, simply another win, one of many, part of the steady accumulation of victories that had built his career. He gave no interviews about who had been in the crowd that night, and if he was ever asked directly, no record of his answer survived in any form that became part of his public story. For Edith Piaf, the evening became something she rarely discussed either. Not because it embarrassed her, but because by the time anyone might have asked her about it directly, it no longer needed explaining. The thing she had spent so much care protecting had simply stopped being something that required protection. Not because she had decided to let it go, but because a crowd of strangers in an arena had decided it for her. In the space of a few whispered words and one ordinary turn of the head. What the evening revealed, in the end, was not a secret. It was something closer to the limits of secrecy itself. The fact that for two people whose lives were watched as closely as theirs were, there had perhaps never really been a secret at all. Only an agreement shared by everyone around them to behave as though there were. And on one ordinary night, in a crowded arena full of cigarette smoke and noise, that agreement simply ran out, in the most unremarkable way imaginable. A woman in a dark coat, sitting a little too still, in a row a little too far back, watching a fight she had only wanted to watch like anyone else.